Welcome drummers, my name is Brandon. I'm a fitness professional who specializes in biomechanics and muscle system performance, and I've spent the last 10 years helping drummers like you play forever. We're going to do that through drum set ergonomics, and we're going to talk about how to make sure the geometry of the instrument helps you to do what you love to do quickly. This is an introduction to an entire deep dive on drum set ergonomics and fitness that you can find on my website. But we're not going to talk about that today. We're going to talk about some practical information for you. There are two key concepts that we have to consider before we even start setting up the drums. One is the 80-20 rule, and the second is something that I like to call anatomy. When we talk about the 80-20 rule, it's a very simple idea that when we think about the drum set, we have traditional geometries that are set up based off of a 4-piece drum set like a jazz kit, Travis Barker drum set, the Joey Jordison double bass drum set, all of these things that are 100% based off of drummers and their genres, and we get gravitated towards them, and what do? We set up a drum set just like them. That is wonderful and really a fun place to start. But truthfully, we have to think about you and your individual anatomy and your individual goals, because if you're playing drums, music, and expressing art, what we should do is triage the instruments, right? Prioritize the instruments that you're going to be playing for your art form, the things that help you have a unique voice, but also cater to your genre. And so when we talk about the 80-20 rule, as we start getting into anatomy, and if you get into the full course, you'll see we do a full deep dive. Some of your joints have way more motion than others, but there's also joint ranges that are a little bit more comfortable and a little bit less stressful from a muscle tension and just joint geometry perspective. So when we consider the 80-20 rule as an example, if I take my arms and I externally rotate out as far as I possibly can, this is something in anatomy called an active range of motion. I actively pulled myself here, and I can get my arms out to about 85 degrees on both sides, right? 0 to 85. But when I'm here, I experience a lot of tension here. So if I turn my arms back in and I go, oh, this is actually a comfortable amount of external rotation where I personally, subjectively feel no tension. This is a qualitative place where I could hang out all day and feel nothing. And so for me, I think about the 80-20 rule. What instruments do I play 80% of the time? And I want to try and get them in this field here so I have the least amount of stress on my body. That doesn't mean that I can't put things out here, but that's where the 20% comes in. I want to have a crazy china that I hit as an accent once in a while. I can go from this 45 degrees to 85 degrees. So for the 80% of the time, for everything we're going to set up going forward, we're going to kind of stay neutral and in this comfortable zone. And good thing, you play right hand hi-hat, you can still do that. The zones that get a little more tension and a little bit more work for you subjectively, we're only going to hang out there 20% of the time, and in my opinion, even less. And if you get into the full course, you'll see where we have to talk about this, because oftentimes these extremes of motion with repetitive motion are where drummers often get injured. But also, we lose performance there. So if you want to be fast, efficient, and express yourself effortlessly, this 80% zone is going to be where we're going to do it. If we jump into anatomy, as you can see here, I have my friend Bart, the skeleton. And so we're not going to do a deep dive on anatomy today, but I would encourage you to check out some of the resources I'll be providing, because truthfully, understanding the skeletal system and the muscular system, there's a lot at play. Here's one thing. I've been working with a lot of pro drummers, high level people that are 50, 60 years old, that are making a ton of money working with the best artists in the world, but they have huge injuries from a lack of education from years prior. And they would say that, not just I. When we think about the body, once you get past the age of 25 and 30, there's a biological process called senescence. You start to get older. Your body can't regenerate as quickly. And when you hear drummers having injuries like carpal tunnel syndrome, back, tight hips, you see that there's a lot of injuries and problems that are ubiquitous of being a drummer. And part of that has to do with the geometry of the anatomy and what we're forced in when we're sitting on a drum throne or whatever it may be. And part of it just has to do with how much stress we experience by actually performing the same actions over time. That 80-20 rule is trying to negate some of those negative effects from these harsh positions that we have to be in being a seated musician, because being seated is not a fantastic place to be all the time. If you actually look at this bass drum beater, you might be able to see that the bass drum beater is actually worn away on one side compared to the other, right? This is a low boy beater, very cool, but it's worn way more at the top and the bottom. And this is after thousands of bass drum strokes. But this is what happens to your bones, is over time, people who get back problems, herniated discs, damage, whatever it may be, it's insidious, it's small, it's quick, it's little things like that with quick strokes, thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of times that wear away all the way where you go through your cartilage down to getting arthritis. And so why I bring this up, and this is my expertise with my day-to-day business at my gym, Strata Internal Performance, where people struggling with things like this, worn away bones and arthritis, because this is easily preventable if you progress your body right and the geometry of your drum set is set up around you. So we're gonna dive into this, but here's what we're considering. We're gonna be thinking about your individual anatomy and your proportions, your injury history, everything about you is gonna determine where the instrument goes. Now we have some basic rules that we're gonna consider to try and reduce some of the stress here, but 80-20 rule and anatomy. Let's get started with the drum throne. We have a huge section in the full course on drum throne, but there's two things that I want you to think about. Are you performing within your active range of motion, like I just talked about, and are you sitting in the middle of the drum throne? There's a lot of conjecture as to should you sit at the front of the drum throne or the back of the drum throne, like the center. I'm going to encourage that you sit in the center. And you'll see I've done an experiment many times before where if I'm sitting in the middle of the drum throne and I weigh 85 pounds, the total resistance of my feet at the bass drum pedal, sitting like I'm playing a regular kit, whether I'm playing heel down or heel up, each leg at my feet weighs 15 pounds as I am here. When I sit on the edge of the drum throne, while there's a lot of other things that'll pop up here, there's actually way more weight at my feet. It actually jumps all the way up to 25 and sometimes 35 pounds on each leg. This means that if I'm playing any bass drum stroke, be it a hip stroke, an ankle stroke, or even a dorsiflexion foot up and down stroke for heel down or ankle technique, I'm picking up all that extra resistance. So to reduce the amount of effort on our body, we're gonna do a couple things. We're gonna sit in the middle of the drum throne, so the drum throne takes way more of our weight than our actual feet do, which is great. The other thing about sitting in the middle of the drum throne, which is gonna be really important, is if I lift my feet up, I can actually sit and not touch the ground. I can maintain my center of mass over this, which means that I can actually use each leg independently, like playing double bass or syncopated left foot and bass drum patterns, and not be limited by the mass of my leg. If my legs weigh 15 pounds and I'm 185, I can pick this weight up and move it very easily, which you never really do what I just did there. If I'm sitting on the edge, the amount of resistance I experience is a lot more. Now I'm quite strong. I can still do this, but I would rather pick up 15 pounds 100 times than 35 pounds 100 times, or 30 pounds with both legs 100 times versus 70 pounds. It's a huge difference over time. The second thing is we want to adjust the drum throne height to our active range of motion. What is that? The Coles notes I'll give you for this, that's all you need to get started, is when you're sitting on your drum throne, you want to make sure that if you place your hands on your lower back, you can lift up your leg and experience no motion in the lower back. There's a codependent relationship between your hip and your low back called the lumbo-pelvic rhythm. And when I run out of motion at this joint, my lower back will move when this joint runs out of motion. So I go into hip flexion like I just showed you, it can't go any further, and the lower back has to pick up all the motion, which that is not good. This is where, which by the way, I will say this, anatomically, very normal process, very good to be able to do this, but when we're playing the drums, if you're playing bass drum strokes of any magnitude and you see someone doing this back motion when they play, right? They lift their leg. That is a tremendous amount of repetitive stress in the back. And just think, if you're playing a set and you play 200 bass drum strokes, that means you do this 200 times, which is your lower back going into flexion, lateral flexion, and rotation 200 times. And that's just one performance. If you do all this repetitive motion in the back, joints like the articular facets and the discs over time can take way too much stress, and this is where we get damage. So, 1, sit in the middle of the drum throne, make sure you can lift your feet right off the ground and hover. Slowly move your feet to where you're going to place your pedals. We're going to talk about that in a second. And make sure you're sitting right in the middle of the drum throne so your center of mass is over your base of support. And this will allow you to reduce the stress going through your feet. If you sit too high, it can create stress in your lower back. You sit too low, it can create stress in your lower back. So you can see for me here, personally, my legs are about an 80-degree angle. That's where I like to be. But sit on your drum throne, see if you can lift your legs one at a time without motion in your back. If you feel your lower back moving, try and play with the height and come up a little bit or go down a little bit. But I don't think many drummers should be at 90 degrees. I don't think too many drummers should be sitting way too high at 35, 40 degrees. Ultimately, make sure you feel comfortable. Step 2, we're going to add in the bass drum pedals. So coming back to that active range of motion assessment, the range that I can move my body with an active control without compromising anything, we're going to try and put these pedals in. So what I want you to do before you do anything is place your feet on the ground where they feel comfortable. Now the one restriction that we're going to have is we're probably going to have a snare drum between our legs. And traditional snare drums are 14 inches wide with hardware making them about 15 to 17 inches wide. Now, if you can't open your legs comfortably like I'm about to display, playing a smaller snare drum might be wise for you. So what I want you to do is you're gonna place your feet on the ground, and while trying to keep your knees over top of your feet, you're gonna slide your knees open and see where they feel comfortable. For me, I wanna play a double bass pedal and a hi-hat, and if I'm sitting as I am right now, I can place my feet just like so, with my feet right underneath my knees or just a little bit in front, very comfortably without anything getting in the way. If you're really not sure if your foot's in the right spot, one thing that you can do really simply is think about actually just playing the bass drum pedal. If I'm playing double bass, does this actually feel comfortable here? Well, I'll tell you what, if I actually come underneath me, this does not feel very comfortable. And if I'm too far away, that doesn't feel very comfortable. So if I'm here and I'm doing hip dominant strokes or I'm doing ankle strokes, these all feel very good. So for me, I'm gonna try and place the bass drum pedal right where my feet are. And so I can easily do that by sliding it right underneath my foot. Doop, doop, and boop, boop. Now the question often comes is, what angle should the bass drum pedals actually be? What I tell you to do is you're just gonna try and get it in line with your foot. So your feet will naturally have a bit of a obliquity, if you will, or a bit of rotation outwards. So I have the pedals lined up with my feet. This feels pretty comfortable here. Good. Now I can add the hi-hat in. There's a great question of, do you triage the hi-hat or the bass drum pedal, double bass pedal, or whatever it is, or other bass drum pedals? We can talk about more of that in the advanced course. But for me right now, this feels like a pretty good place to start. So we can add the bass drum in, and then we can start talking about hi-hat, snare drum. Now, one simple hack I am going to do is when I'm placing the hardware down for the snare drum, I'm going to try and make sure that the pivot joint is facing towards my groin. This is going to make sure that if I need to adjust this, I can adjust the angle really well and really quickly. So the DW9000, I got it right there, not hitting any of my pedals, but the actual gear is facing toward me so I can adjust the snare drum in and out. So it's starting to look like a drum kit now. So what I've got here is I've got this Keplinger black iron snare drum, which is a very cool snare drum. Very heavy, by the way, so adjusting it up and down is not a fantastic feeling thing. But we're gonna come back to that 80-20 idea. Before we talk about this, we're gonna talk about the hi-hat. All I want you to do is when you're playing the hi-hat, right, you'll see a lot of people reaching over like this. So their arm will be kind of protracted forward like so. If you're playing the hi-hat and your shoulder has to come forward at all, I want you to pay attention that even holding your arm out in front increases the tension of the scapular retractors of the muscles on the upper back, which can be a big problem because if you feel tension there just by reaching, even a little, this means as you're performing and your adrenaline goes up, that area is going to be working a lot harder. So I want to make sure that you adjust your hi-hat and stick choices potentially. So if your elbow is underneath your shoulder and you turn your arm in, you hit the hi-hat. Now I got a bit of a problem here. At the moment, I cannot hit the hi-hat as you can see from this position. And I'm even playing a longer stick, Vic Firth X55A, which is 16.5 inches long. And I'm ghosting here. I have to reach to hit the hi-hat. So my bass drum pedal is already as tight as it can be. What I am going to try and do is move this as close as I can without hitting the bass drum pedal. And sometimes with these hi-hats, especially if they've got 3 legs, you have to adjust things a little bit. But now I've adjusted it. I can move it closer. Perfect. The pedal's not overlapped. Hit the bass drum, hit the hi-hat. Good. And now from this position, hi-hat is close to me. So if I turn my arm in without looking at it, I can hit it pretty easily. Good. So this is nice because now if I turn both arms, externally rotate and internally rotate, I can hit this and have no limitations whatsoever. So this is perfect. So now I've got a double bass pedal, I got the hi-hat, everything is within my active range of motion and my 80-20. Now some people will ask, well, if I'm doing this external and internal rotation, should I not turn my spine to play the hi-hat? In my opinion, I want everyone playing as neutral as possible because truthfully, this is where you're gonna do the least amount of work. And honestly, my biased opinion, I think all drummers who are playing top 40 gigs should consider playing open-handed because it's just one of the most ergonomical, efficient ways to play. So we got the hi-hat, we got the bass drum pedal in a good spot. So now we should probably talk about the snare drum. So coming back to the snare drum, I'm gonna show you 2 simple things. When we're talking about, we're gonna talk about the height and the angle. So if we talk about the height, we just need to think about from a performance perspective, what height you wanna play the snare drum. Now, there's a lot of variations that go here, and if you play traditional grip, this is a little bit of a different conversation. But for me, I play match grip. I like to play rock and metal music as my primary genres. So for me, I want to have access to the rim shot, and I also want to make sure I can play ghost notes. So right now, you can see where the snare drum is angled. If I hold my arms at this kind of 90-degree angle, where I have my elbow not back behind my body, elbow right underneath my arm, and I bring the tips of the stick down, right now without reaching back at all. My elbows are right beside my body. The tips of the stick hit the middle of the snare drum. If my elbows were back here and I sit in the middle of the snare drum, I want to move the snare drum a little bit further away as much as I can based off the geometry of the drum set to make sure I'm hitting the middle without bringing my elbows back. Elbows back will increase the amount of work of our upper back muscles and neck and can turn into this kind of thing or this kind of thing. So we're going to try and stay away from that. I also want to make sure I can play a rim shot from here. Now, right now, you can probably see from the side camera, I can hit the middle of the snare drum, but the actual rim is much lower than my thigh, so I can rest the drumstick on my leg and not hit the rim. So I have to change something here. So I'm going to raise the snare drum up just a little bit, and hopefully this Keplinger drum complies a little. There we go, big snare drum. Perfect, that's looking a little bit better. Now if I come back to this same angle, I can hit the middle of the snare drum pretty easily, hit a rim shot pretty easily, and not distract everyone in my gym. By the way, my studio you see here is over top of a 4,000 square foot gym, so I have to be a little quiet. So I've got this here. This is looking pretty good. Maybe a little high for me. I'll bring it down just a clip and see if we can get away with it. And I only say that because I can feel my elbows bending a little bit more. So we'll kind of go somewhere in between. There we go. So I can hit the rim shot now, I can hit the middle of the drum and not hit my leg, which is cool. And I can do it on both sides, which is great. The angle always comes into question. And here's what I would throw out there to you. When you're thinking about the angle, we have to think a little less about the angle and more of the attack of the drumstick. When you think about throwing a sling, like you're gonna, like David and Goliath, use a sling and try and throw the rock. When I strike the snare drum, we need the tip of the drumstick to hit the drum at a 90-degree angle. And anything that is not a 90-degree angle is wasting energy as far as rotary forces are concerned. So if I'm hitting the drum at this angle obviously, or this angle, we're not going to get very much rotation. So we're not even talking about technique today, but we're just talking about the angle. I want the drumstick to bounce back toward me. If I raise the stick up, the stick will still bounce, but I'm wasting energy and it will modify how the percussive sound of the instrument sounds. So for me, I would suggest you experiment with flat and see what that feels like. For me personally, I've measured this with an inclinometer, and my snare drum angles are always at 5 degrees toward me because it allows for whatever motion is happening at my wrist to get an optimal bounce, which is great. And on top of that, it allows me to get a rim shot. When I try flat, I just find I'm getting way too many rim shots and it influences my ghost notes personally. But experiment. One of my friends, Paul from Silverstein, he actually plays with the drum angled a little bit away with match grip, and that's okay because it actually works within his active range of motion of his wrists. And so in the full course, we do a full deep dive on wrist anatomy and the mechanics of that, of going into different positions. But ultimately, we want to try and make sure is once you're hitting the middle of the drum, you're hitting it at a 90-degree angle so the drumstick can do the most work. And right off the bat now, from a kick, snare, hat perspective, we're doing pretty good here. We've got everything in a good enough position that I don't have to work that hard to hit all these instruments. This is a pretty solid home base, and whenever I get a brand new drum set, this is exactly what I do. Now you can get a measuring tape and a dynamometer and all these other tools that we use in the advanced course to kind of make sure everything is as precise as possible, but truthfully, this is bare bones, the most basic way to get things set up. Now once you have all of this, we can figure out what is the next thing that we're going to set up. Do we want to set up a hi-hat? Do we want a rack tom? Do we want a floor tom? A left side floor tom or snare drum? My bias is. But truthfully, when you're considering ergonomics, I really want you to think about these basic principles. Are we striking things where the drumstick or the bass drum beater is doing the least amount of work? Are the instruments close enough that I don't have to work that hard to actually do the things that I want to do? Is my body in a position where it doesn't have to work hard at all? And once we think about this 80-20 rule, right? 80% of the time, everything is within this comfortable zone. And 20% of the time, the things we play 20% of the time are a little bit further away. We end up in this place that we can play effortlessly and freely and really relaxed and have a really, really great time. So the bias of the entire course is to truthfully make sure that the geometry of the instrument that is forced upon you just because of the shapes of the instrument don't get in your way. And you can keep doing the things that you want to do. You don't get injured and you don't get hurt. Here's the fun thing, is say you set this all up and you're a longer person, like my friend Joe. He's long, big guy, long limbs, lanky, even in his words. and that pushes the hi-hat further away. Well, now these are 14-inch hi-hats. Maybe he plays a 16-inch hi-hat to move the edge of the cymbal towards him by an inch, and maybe he plays a 17-inch thick. So that way he's modifying his actual tool choices based off of his anatomy and the drum set and getting some very cool sounds. Anyway, thanks so much for checking this out. My name is Brandon Green. If you liked this, I would really encourage you to check out the full series of courses that we have on the website. The Drum Set Ergonomics course is one of the things I'm most proud of. I spent many years writing for Modern Drummer, and these are a lot of details that have been ironed out over the last 10 years. But at the end of the day, start with this basic information, practice, play, and if something doesn't feel right, let me know. I'd love to see if I can assist. Thank you so much for being here. This is Brandon from Drum Mechanics. Stronger drummers play longer, and I'll see everybody real soon.